All right, welcome everyone. Please take your seats, we can get started. I am John Onesorg. I'm on the faculty here at the law school, and I direct the East Asian Legal Studies Center, which is one of the co-sponsors of the event. And I'm going to be very brief. I just wanted to thank all the co-sponsors, and it's a fairly long list of co-sponsors, so I'm going to make sure I don't forget anybody. The Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, CROW, the Tommy Thompson Center, the Center for East Asian Studies, the La Follette School, and my center, the East Asian Legal Studies Center. So thanks to all the co-sponsors, and special thanks to Lori Dennis, who did probably 90+% of the actual work setting this up. There she is. In fact, Lori. All right, so I am going to turn it over to Mike Netter, introduce our speaker. Mike, for those of you who don't know, is the former faculty member and dean of the Wisconsin School of Business, and is currently the CEO of the Wisconsin Foundation for Alumni Association, WFAA. Before he went over to the dark side of administration and fundraising, he was a scholar of international economics and trade, and started out at the Tuck Business School at Dartmouth. So I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here today. This promises to be a great conversation and presentation by Dr. Lardy. And yeah, when John asked me to be a moderator, I said, of course, because there's so many things in society that need moderating today. And I'll do my part here this afternoon, but there's a lot of things I wish I could moderate that I don't think I can. But anyway, thank you all for joining us. Today's topic is, of course, one of the most important global issues of our time. It's the economic relationship between the U.S. and China, which, of course, is tangled up in our political relationship, our military relationship, et cetera. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicholas Lardy, who's going to be presenting to us today, and he is indeed one of the world's foremost experts on this topic. He's been called by the National Journal everybody's guru on China. He is currently a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where he's been since 2003, after he spent 8 years at the Brookings Institute as a senior fellow. And for those who don't follow the think tanks, I can assure you that Brookings and Peterson are really kind of the gold standard of quality work, certainly in my field of economics, among the Washington think tanks. And so it's a great honor to have Dr. Lardy with us. He's held academic appointments as the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, and he's been an adjunct professor at the Yale School of Management. He's a member of the Distinguished Council on Foreign Relations and the editorial boards of Asia Policy and China Review. He is also a prolific author, too many books for me to list them all, but it's kind of interesting to look back at the titles and see through the years kind of how the questions and observations, perspectives about China have evolved from 2006, where the book was China, the Balance Sheet, What the World Needs to Know Now About the Emerging Superpower. And then in 2014, Markets Over Mao, The Rise of Private Business in China. And then in 2019, The State Strikes Back, The End of Economic Reforms in China, ? And maybe that question will get answered today. And of course, the policy changes that are going on in the world are being discussed today are not just internal to China. It's one of the central issues in the US presidential election. And so this dynamic relationship between the US and China there's really a lot in play today, and there's a lot at stake. There probably isn't a more important bilateral relationship in the world economy and maybe in the world period than the United States and China. So without further ado, Dr. Nicholas Lardy, please.
Thank you very much, Mike, for moderating. This must be about your busiest week of the year, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come and be here this afternoon and play the role you're playing. Before I begin the substance of my remarks, I would like to say I got my start at the University of Wisconsin in studying political science, economics, and the Chinese language, and I've been working that terrain ever since I graduated in 1968. So I got a very good start, and I'm very happy about that. I'm going to divide my remarks into three sections. First, I want to do a bit on explaining China's long-term success, its rapid economic growth since reforms began in the late 1970s. Then I want to deal with something that Mike just mentioned, the state striking back. How have things changed in the Xi Jinping era, which basically started in 2012, and the role of the market was diminished somewhat, or certainly didn't expand at the pace it had previously. And the third component is to deal with what Mike mentioned at the end of his introduction, and that is what's the nature of the economic relationship between China and the United States? What are the sources of the friction? And how does that manifest in U.S. government and Chinese government policy? But I want to, as I said, start by what are the sources of the long-term growth China experienced really for more than 3 decades, starting in the late 1970s. And my explanation is pretty simple: the rise of the private sector. There was no private sector in China in the previous years, even in the agricultural sector, which I'm not going to talk very much about. Everything was organized into collective groups, and the government was playing a role in the agricultural sector. But in the non-agricultural sector, the urban sector, in 1978, they began by revising the Constitution. Now, maybe John can tell us sometimes that can be pretty significant. It's a turning point. And the revision was to allow the creation of family firms in urban areas. Prior to that time, you couldn't own a business or do any business in urban areas. But you couldn't hire more than 7 non-family members. Someone told me once that the 7 number is in marks. It's okay if you have up to 7, but beyond 7, it's exploitation of labor. Now, I never checked to see whether that's actually true, but that was, where did 7 come from? Maybe that was where it came from. So, the Marxist ideology was still in vogue at that time, and so that was the beginning of the private sector in China, but obviously very limited if you couldn't hire more than 7 people outside your own family. The next step didn't come until a decade later in 1988, when they promulgated regulations on private enterprises, which allowed for more employees, but only in proprietorships or partnerships. Now, again, John could illuminate this better than I can, but if you have a proprietorship or a partnership and you're doing a good business, but then things go south, all your own personal assets are at risk. So a lot of people don't want to have a partnership or something that has that kind of vulnerability. The company law was passed in 1994, which said you could have private limited liability companies. So you could form a limited liability company, have a business, hire more than 7 people. That was a big step forward that led to the establishment of a lot of private companies. Another amendment to the Constitution came a year later in 1989, and again, politically it was quite important. The Constitution previously had said that private firms were an important component of a state-dominated economy. The new language was that private firms, they didn't say private, by the way, non-state. They're kind of allergic to using the word private, so those were referred to as non-state firms. So non-state firms were, quote, an essential component of a mixed economy. So again, reflected a change in attitudes and policy on the results on the private sector. The results of this, I think, were simply astounding. The private share of capital formation, which of course is a very important source of growth in any economy, rose dramatically, and the share of state firms fell by more than half. It was over 80% in 1980. By 2012, it was down to 14%. So they were still investing, but the economy had grown and privates were taking a bigger role. So the share of private investment went down. Even more dramatic was the expansion of private employment. Private employment accounted for about 95% of the increase in employment in urban areas from the late 1970s up to around 2012. And private firms in number expanded dramatically. They've actually published a figure that says in 1978, there were only 150,000 people employed in private companies in urban areas. You know, China's a big place. 150,000 would have been 0.2% of the workforce. In other words, it basically didn't exist. By 2012, it was more than 250 million people were employed in private businesses. So virtually all of the expansion of employment in urban areas over this period was in the private sector. Private firms also became extremely important in generating exports. I think everybody knows that China has become a big exporting economy. Well, initially, almost all the exports were undertaken by state companies, and the private share went from nothing to about 40% by 2012, and about another 50% was foreign firms that had invested in China and were selling into the international market, and of course, they were all private. So the state share of exports went from about 100% to 10%. So they were expanding a little bit, but everything was growing rapidly, so their share was going down. So those are just some numbers. You know, I'm an economist, so I have to give you some numbers to demonstrate the expansion and the role of the private sector. The official data indicated by around 2012 that about 60% of the economy of gross domestic product, if you want to think of it in those terms, was coming from private firms. Now, how is this possible? And I think the answer is very simple. Private companies were far more efficient than state companies. In this period of rapid growth in the overall economy and the expanding role of private companies, the increase in productivity, which economists like to measure, you know, what can you produce with another bundle of inputs of capital and labor? Productivity, measured by total factor productivity, was growing, according to an estimate of the IMF, at almost 4% per year. So they were growing at 9% or so. About half of that came not just from the expansion of capital or the expansion of the modern sector workforce, but using those inputs more efficiently. You know, the private firms were motivated by profit, and they arranged their businesses so that they became more efficient. So that was the superior performance of private companies was a big part of the success. Now, as I've already indicated or hinted, things began to change when Xi Jinping came into power and became the party chairman and took over a number of other positions. Starting in 2012, around 2012, 2013, he became head of the government and head of the Communist Party, and he began to talk about the importance of state companies. Many of his speeches have lines like, we must have a bigger and more powerful state sector. And he didn't talk so much about private companies. And what happened in the early years is that the share of investment undertaken by private companies the growth of it slowed down dramatically. Instead of growing 3 times more rapidly than state company investment, it was about equal. So this growth rate relative to state companies declined by 2/3. Bank credit went increasingly to state companies. Remember, in China, all the big banks at that time, and still today, are owned by the government, and the biggest shareholders are government. And when the heads of these banks hear the chairman of the party saying, we must have a bigger state sector, they get the message. They reallocate their lending priorities to state companies and gave less money to private companies. Offshore IPOs by private companies declined, sometimes dramatically, as in the case of Ant Financial, which is trying to do a big IPO, and it was pulled at the last minute. And they did some other things. The role of party committees was enhanced, and even in private companies. Private companies, historically, for the most part, did not have party committees. But under Xi Jinping, they insisted that most private companies would have to have a party committee. Party committee is supposed to be looking over the shoulder of the entrepreneurs and seeing if everything they're doing is consistent with party policy and whatever was in Xi Jinping's most recent speech. They also initiated what they called a golden share program, in which state companies were allowed to, or encouraged actually, to take shares in private companies. So private companies were under pressure from these party committees on the one hand, and the state buying up their shares, at least if they were listed on the market, to get a greater voice in the operation of private companies. Obviously, this had a discouraging effect on entrepreneurs. They were worried that they were going to get bought out by state companies at prices that were going to be determined by the state, not by the market. And it tended to put a damper on private sector growth. Another thing that happened more recently is a lot of private companies got started with venture capital investment or private equity investment, which was booming in China until the last 5 or 6 years. But that too has almost evaporated. So this source of financing for private companies diminished quite significantly, whether the firms, the VC/PE companies, were domestic or international. What happened to productivity? Fell by more than half. Again, according to the IMF, productivity growth since 2012 has declined to less than 2%. So we went from 4% to around 2% or a little less. So productivity growth declined by half. So if you wanted to have the first explanation of why China is growing a little bit more, not a little bit, a lot more slowly in the last few years, in the last decade, it's because productivity growth has fallen by roughly half or even a little bit more. So that's the story of the long-term success, the rise of the private sector from the 78 for the next 3 decades or so, and then the slowdown in growth under the Xi Jinping leadership, which shows no sign of ending anytime soon since he's suspended the Constitution so he could run for a 3rd term. In fact, there's no limit anymore on the number of terms he can hold. This was considered by those people who follow Chinese politics, and I do just a little bit in the previous period. There was a lot of regularization. There were term limits. You could only serve twice in certain positions. And there were retirement ages that were enforced. Once you got to a certain, you couldn't assume an important position if you were 65 or older. So they had a retirement system and they had term limits. That's all been erased. And most people think Xi Jinping plans to stay around for quite a while. It may not turn out that way, but the institutional constraints that previously held have been evaporated. So turning to the third topic, U.S.-China economic frictions and decoupling or delinking, and I think that is the key question. Initially, the phrase that was used by the administration was decoupling, which implied a complete separation of the two economies. Then someone in Europe introduced the phrase, de-risking. So that has become the term of art now when the administration talks about their economic policy towards China is de-risking rather than decoupling. So we'll still have some economic interchange, trade, financial flows, and so forth, but certain elements are going to be eliminated or reduced under this de-risking approach. But it's hard to separate exactly what is the difference between decoupling and de-risking, and how does de-risking evolve over time. And I'll just say a few things about that. The Biden administration in 2022 introduced their, a paper on what they call their Indo-Pacific strategy. And it was very specific. It called for the balance of influence in the world that is maximally favorable to the United States. Pretty clear. A few months later, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave a speech which kind of put operational context on this. How do you achieve maximal influence in the global system? And he said that there would be a policy of developing as large a lead as possible in certain technologies, such as semiconductors and so forth. The US should have as large a lead as possible over China. This was a pretty dramatic change from a long-standing policy, which some people referred to as a kind of sliding scale approach. That is, as the US moved to higher levels of technology, China could follow along behind as long as they were, say, 2 or 3 generations behind, let's say, in the development of semiconductors. But if the goal now is to have a maximum gap between the US level of technology and the Chinese level of technology, that was, I think, a fundamental change that is not really been widely recognized. And that became the official policy in September of 2022, so a couple of years ago. What has that meant? It has meant a very substantial increase in export controls on China. Sullivan characterized his approach as a small yard and a high fence, meaning we're going to only restrict certain technologies that are very closely related to national security, but we're going to have a high fence. We're going to make it almost impossible for the Chinese to get access to these kinds of technologies. But what has happened since then is that the number of restrictions has expanded over and over and over again. More restrictions have been put on China in the Biden administration than were put on during the Trump administration on these various lists. And it seems to be consistent with his idea that we have to maintain as large a lead as possible. And so the question is, maybe the fence is getting higher, maybe the yard is getting bigger, but if you're sitting in China looking at this, it certainly doesn't look like a very limited policy as it was advertised at the outset. So increasing restrictions, not just on exports by US companies, but we've also, under the Biden administration, expanded the controls so that other countries will also be required to restrict exports to China if the production of the product involves any US technology or software. So if you're operating in France or Great Britain or anywhere in the world, if you're producing something that relies on US software or US technology, you're not supposed to be able to export it to China without getting a license. So this kind of extraterritorial imposition of restrictions has been a new development under the Biden administration. And it's been very obvious in the case of the machinery that is necessary for the production of advanced semiconductors, which is made by 2 companies, one in the Netherlands and one in Japan. The administration has twisted arms on those governments to have them restrict the export of these advanced lithography machines that are used to produce semiconductors. We're also seeing now that the United States is going to propose restrictions on US companies investing in China so that source of technology is going to be cut off. And we're also doing things like putting a 100% tariff on imported electric vehicles from China. And more recently, it has been mooted that we're going to prevent the import of any vehicle from any country that includes Chinese software in the self-driving mechanisms. China's really in the vanguard on this, ahead of US companies and other companies. And if that technology is used in a car, even if it's made in France or South Korea, it will not be imported into the United States. Another dimension of the friction, of course, everyone's read about, that is this new surge of industrial policy in the United States to bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States. This has been heavily emphasized by President Biden and candidate Harris. And it involves a number of different areas, but I'm very skeptical that this is going to work. I don't think we are very efficient at infrastructure programs. And one good example, in 2021, the Investment Infrastructure Act allocated $7.5 billion US to construct 500,000 public charging stations for electric vehicles. Obviously, the shortage of charging stations is an impediment to people moving into electric vehicles. As of a few months ago, 7 stations were open. Well, you know, we have a very cumbersome process. For the feds give money to the states, and then the states establish criteria for where these are going to go and who's going to build them, and the result is, in a period of years where the Chinese put up tens of thousands of miles of the highest high-speed train in the world, we've gotten 7 charging stations up and operating on a budget of $3.5 billion. So, and some of these things, you can tell I'm a little bit skeptical about industrial policy that is such an important part of a current economy. And they're also talking about a huge increase in investment as a result of the various acts that have been passed. The Financial Times did a very interesting investigation, and they found that as of the middle of this year, they looked at all the public announcements of new projects that were being undertaken with this federal funding. They only looked at big ones that were more than $100 million each. They found 114 of these projects that had been announced by various companies. However, 40% of these projects have either been delayed between 2 months and several years, or postponed indefinitely, or canceled. In other words, companies seem to be very good at announcing new projects, new investment undertaken with federal money, but the actual execution lags or falls short. So I'm not sure that this kind of industrial policy is going to lead to the results that some people want. And there's another problem that has not gotten very much attention, and that is the costs. It's wonderful if we can build all these sophisticated semiconductors in Arizona and other places, but Boris Chang, who was the founder and longtime chairman of TSMC, which is the world's largest producer of high-end semiconductors, well, they've estimated it costs them 4 to 5 times as much to build a fab in Arizona as in the United States, as in Taiwan. And their costs of producing these things once they're up and running is roughly 2 times what it is in Taiwan. So I've asked some of the people in Washington that are involved in this, who's going to pay 2 times more for semiconductors when you can still import them from Taiwan? Are we going to put on tariffs on imports of Taiwan? Or are we going to subsidize the production of semiconductors in the United States indefinitely? If so, how much is it going to cost? But this is one of the problems in Washington. National security is number one, and they don't, well, Mike would know, this idea of doing a cost-benefit analysis or looking, okay, maybe it's a good idea to do this. How much is it going to cost? You know, how should we take that into account in our planning and our thinking? So I don't think that's going on. So I think that this idea that we're going to overtake China in terms of some of these high technology areas is not necessarily very well founded, and it has the unintended consequence of forcing the Chinese to pursue self-sufficiency. If they can't buy these things from the United States or other countries that are participating in these restrictions, then they're going to have to develop them on their own. And once they develop them on their own, the U.S. market for these products in China is going to disappear. And most of these companies, whether you're talking about Intel or any of the other high-tech companies in the United States, anywhere between 30 and 40% of their income has come from selling products to China. Well, if China can't buy these products, then that income is going to be reduced. The R&D expenditures of these companies is going to be curtailed. And the idea that we're going to maintain our lead in some of these technologies, I think, looks increasingly doubtful. One other thing I would mention is that they're talking not only about Biden and his vice president are talking not only about how much investment is being encouraged by these programs, but we're going to revive manufacturing manufacturing employment. But manufacturing employment has been going up a little bit in the last few years. It's still below where it was in 2019. So we're having a little recovery of manufacturing employment after COVID, but we're still below where we were before, and the likelihood is that we will never get back. If you go back to the 50s, manufacturing employment was 40%, then it was 30%, then it was 10%. It's down now to, I don't remember, 8% or something like that. So the idea that we're going to revive manufacturing employment is going to be a source of national strength. I'm skeptical, and even if it can be achieved in part, I'm a little worried about how high the cost would be. So just to wrap up and summarize, China's period of most rapid growth was when the private sector was getting a very expanded role in the economy. Chinese entrepreneurs jumped at the chance to move into business. Once that environment deteriorated, the economy slowed down, state companies took on a bigger role, they're less efficient, productivity growth. It didn't disappear, but it was cut down. It fell quite significantly under Xi Jinping, who has emphasized the role of the state, the role of the party, and occasionally gives some lip service to private companies, but the policies don't really back it up. So I think this is part of what's led to the friction between China and the United States. I think initially there was the view that China was becoming more like us. They were getting to be a market economy. The role of state companies was eroding. The role of the party was subject to some limitations and actually seemed to be falling. And that all began to change under Xi Jinping when he talked about the importance of the party, the central role of state companies. And he also began adopting much more, I'm not quite sure what word I should use here, somewhat more aggressive policies in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Taiwan, and that changed the whole geopolitical context. And the thing that you should remember, maybe it's pretty obvious, but it's really obvious in Washington, the two parties don't agree on anything except how tough to be on China. And even though the sanctions have gone way up and there are more and more restrictions, there are still a lot of members of Congress who think that Biden's not doing enough to punish China, to slow down China. And so I don't think this is going to change very significantly in the short or medium term. The consensus seems very well entrenched, and China's not doing very much to kind of steer things in an alternative direction. They have a very large military buildup underway. They continue to harass the Philippines and all these other countries in the South China Sea. So I think we're in a period of deteriorating economic relations, and I fear that it is going to persist. I'll stop there.
Great. Well, that was a great tour on what a UW-Madison education can do. I feel like, as you noted, you started your studies here and you've just made this your life's work. And that was a great, I thought, narrative explanation of how China has evolved since the 70s. One question I wanted to ask, I'll ask a couple things at the outset and then take audience questions. You know, in the course of all your work, I know you probably look at a variety of data sources to get an understanding of what's really going on the ground in China. And I think in this day and age, it's so important to understand, you know, what is a fact and where do I go as a layperson for reliable information about what is the situation on the ground in China. I'm lucky enough to be on a board with a guy named James Stavridis, a retired admiral. You probably know Stavridis. He's written a lot of books about China and, you know, career in the Navy, et cetera. He says, you know, The Economist would regularly contain about 90% of what he would get in his briefings when he was part of the national security apparatus. So he kind of viewed that as a go-to. But I'm curious, what would you tell people to read as a source of reliable information about what's going on in China?
Well, I know a lot of people assert that a lot of Chinese data is, you know, concocted out of thin air and unreliable and exaggerated and so forth, but this is a very common assertion, but no one's ever produced much evidence that this is actually the case. Some of their data is very weak. Maybe it may be accurate, but not very useful trying to understand what's really going on. They had a data series published until a couple of years ago that showed that unemployment in a younger age group was something like 40%. And then people pointed out, well, you're including everybody who's still in education and so forth as being unemployed, and you should use the standards that the ILO, the International Labor Organization, uses to measure unemployment in this age cohort. So they quit publishing the old data, and after 6 or 8 months, they started publishing new data. And the unemployment rate was still pretty high. I can't remember exactly, something like 18%, but it wasn't 40% anymore. Yeah. So sometimes they revise their data to come into compliance with international standards. That's one example where they've improved their data. I think in general, the data has gotten better. The authorities that publish balance of payments and other trade and financial flows data, since 2015, they have been trying and succeeded in following the balance of payments manual that is promulgated by the International Monetary Fund. And it's called the BPM, the Balance of Payments Manual. And you can see what's happened as that evolution came. You know, they originally just published 2 or 3 numbers: exports, imports, financial flows, and only on annual data. Now they publish highly disaggregated data on a quarterly basis, where the transactions are slotted into the right line, and so their data have become much better as a result. So I'm in the camp that people that criticize Chinese data, usually you ask, well, what's the basis for that? Oh, I read it somewhere,
Right, yeah. So from a data standpoint, you feel pretty comfortable, and then what about kind of higher level narratives? You know, I was doing a little digging around today, and of course, a lot of the stories lately are about the disappearance of business executives in the tech industry or in banking, and what do you make of reports of that? And do you feel that these are like legitimate arrests of people who've defrauded their companies? Because it seems, based on what I read, there's not a lot of information about what's happened, and companies make disclosures like, yes, we have a board member that we're no longer able to contact and we don't know where they are, and there's speculation that they've been arrested, and sometimes that's confirmed, but how do we make sense of that?
Well, it's very difficult, and context matters a great deal. There's no doubt that a lot of people are arbitrarily arrested and disappear, sometimes for months or years, sometimes indefinitely, because they've done something politically to cross the regime. And those cases are deplorable. They're relatively small in number. There's something like 35 million private businesses in China. So you do read, that the head of this company and some of the high-profile companies like Ant Financial or Alibaba, and they've been smacked down. Some of their executives, and they've had big fines and so forth. But I say context is everything, and you know, it's 1.3 billion people and 35 million companies. So you have to put things in context. It's a Communist Party-controlled place, and what we're seeing now is a lot of people that used to be willing to be mildly critical of the government, and particularly not on political issues. You wouldn't do that. That would be too risky. But on things like economics, should China have had a stimulus program 6 or 8 or 10 months ago? Now they've started on one. Is it big enough? Should it be this size or that size? Some people are even kind of pulling back from offering that kind of commentary or criticism. So it's a tough environment.
Audience questions.